Good afternoon and welcome to today's event, our what we call Mini-Roundtable about sort of contemporary issues in geopolitics, both in Greater China and in Southeast Asia. We have had one cancellation, unfortunately, of one of the speakers for our first panel. Jonathan Sullivan is unable to join us today due to an injury he suffered yesterday, unfortunately, so he's not with us today. We're also still waiting for our other panelist to arrive from the station. She's running a bit late. When she does, we'll introduce her. So to start things off on this first panel, which is about geopolitics in Greater China over the last year or so, first I'd like to introduce Yeling from Oxford University and invite her to speak for a brief moment about whatever she thinks are the most important or burning issues in that area.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thanks so much for the invitation to be here. So my name is Yeling. I'm a professor of public policy at the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford. And what's top of my mind these days when I think about geopolitics and China are, of course, US-China relations. I am from Singapore. I grew up in Singapore, but I've spent about half of my life in the United States now, so I'm a fairly new transplant to the UK. So US-China relations are very much top of mind today. I'd like to talk a little bit about the economic security dilemma between these two powers, and then reflect a little bit on the securitization of economic policy in both countries, but in particular in China and the emergence of an economic security state within mainland China. So if we think about US-China relations, right, starting from that angle, we see the two powers engaging in a classic security dilemma tit for tat dynamic in the economic realm, right? In the sense that the US enacts some measures in an effort to strengthen its economic security, reduce its economic vulnerabilities. China feels targeted. China then enacts a retaliatory or a set of countermeasures to try and strengthen its economy, reduce its vulnerabilities. The US then feels threatened in turn, and then you get this back and forth escalatory spiral. We can talk about some of the material underpinnings of this economic security dilemma, but what's interesting to me is the narrative that each party has of the other that really turbocharges the escalatory dynamic. And by narrative, I mean that each has a slightly caricatured narrative about the other's intentions and actions, right? So if we think about from the United States, the perspective of the US, it has an overarching narrative of predation when it comes to China, right? China as a predatory economic threat that hollows out American democracy and hollows out its domestic manufacturing capabilities and so on. If we flip it around, right, there's also a slightly caricatured narrative of the United States from China, and that narrative is one of containment, right, or what official discourse describes as a US-led campaign of containment and suppression, right? And any action from either party is filtered almost exclusively through that lens, right? So any action coming from China is filtered through the lens of predation. Any action coming from the United States is fueled through the lens of containment. And as long as you have these two very deeply, at this point, I would say fairly deeply embedded narratives in each country, it's very hard to escape this economic security dilemma. And it's dangerous because I don't think it's actually making either side more secure. I don't think it's actually making the global economy more secure. In the next panel, we'll talk about Southeast Asia, but I don't think it's making Southeast Asian countries feel more secure. And why is that so? We can walk through the major categories of economic policies that are being securitized vis-a-vis each other, right? So tariffs. The US levies tariffs on China and vice versa. Are these tariffs actually working? I don't think so, right? Because US tariffs on Chinese imports has led to a fair amount of outsourcing of manufacturing activity. So firms move from China to third countries, right? To connector countries, Vietnam, Mexico, and so on. And so the supply chain has not been delinked between the US and China. It's just become longer, more indirect, and more costly. And both sides are still, therefore, indirectly dependent on each other. And both sides could leverage and securitize and weaponize that longer supply chain, right? So the US could cut off inputs going into these connector countries. The US could increase its coverage of tariffs onto these connector countries, Vietnam and Indonesia and so on. So we're not in a more stable world when it comes to tariffs. If we think about export controls, right? So export controls on advanced semiconductors and so on. Has that made either side feel more secure? Not really, right? If we think about how China has been responding to these export controls, to some extent, the export controls have cut off options for Chinese firms that used to prefer sourcing the best inputs from world markets, right? Which meant sourcing from foreign firms, sourcing from American firms. Now the world market has become cut off for certain products and more unpredictable for other products, right? And so domestic Chinese firms naturally turn to the domestic market and to the state for options and for support. So the export controls from the US have, in one sense, pushed state and business closer together within China. And we can discuss what that means for the security relationship between the two countries. But I would imagine that's not something that policymakers would have wanted as a clear outcome in establishing these export controls, right? There's an active discussion out there about whether or not these export controls from the US have actually accelerated Chinese innovation, right? And there are all these examples of Huawei's domestically made chips in its Mate 60 and now Mate 70 cell phone, its Harmony OS system, which is now independent from Android, DeepSeek, of course. And then there's a flip side to that argument where people say, well, actually, it has slowed China down. So I think the debate's open, but the fact that there is a debate shows you how uncertain that situation is. If we look at investment controls, right? So the Trump administration just set out an America First investment policy that strengthens inbound investment screening from Chinese companies, outbound investment flows from US companies into China, and a range of other measures. And that will have a chilling effect that it will deepen the existing chilling effect for Chinese investment flowing into the United States. Right? We can have a discussion of how effective that might be because it not only means there are fewer jobs created in the US from foreign investment, it also means opportunities from learning about leading edge innovation in some of the technologies that China is really good at. Those are cut off. If China tries to retaliate, right, we're going back to this tit for tat. If China tries to retaliate, it will further impact its foreign investment climate, which is already quite dire, right? Net FDI flows into China have been negative for some time now. So neither side is more secure. Neither side's economy has necessarily clearly benefited as a result of this tit for tat escalation. And I think it puts China in a very tricky position because its domestic economy right now is so weak, right? So now if I could just spend a few minutes talking about the economic security state in China. And this has been building for some time now. There's no clear start point, but for the sake of picking a year, right, 2014, we saw the emergence of the comprehensive national security concept in China. And then the following year, the establishment of the national security law. With the emergence and deepening of US-China tensions from the first Trump administration onwards, we started to see the Chinese party states start to emphasize this new term to, quote unquote, coordinate security and development. We saw the emergence and proliferation of the term security in major economic blueprints. So if you go back and you compare the occurrence of the term security in the 13th five-year plan and the 14th five-year plan, right, there's a clear shift, much more discussion of security in the 14th five-year plan. If you look at the Communist Party's third plenum in 2022, that was the start of Xi Jinping's third term. Again, we saw the proliferation of a security framing across many different aspects of Chinese economy and society. So there are about 20 different security terms now floating in the official discourse, right? From political security to territorial security, energy security, economic security, ideological security, system security, information security, technology security, deep space security, polar space security, and so on and so forth. I haven't actually managed to memorize all of them. And what does this mean for economic policy making in China? It confuses the signal, right? Because for many decades, the signal sent by the central government to its local governments and to firms was to develop, to grow, right? It might be quantitative, it might have been quantitative growth in the early decades, a shift to qualitative growth in the later decades. Now the call is to coordinate between security and development. It's very hard to actually do that because the term opens up a fair amount of discretion and interpretive space for different agencies to decide what is or is not a security threat. And risk aversion means that security tends to then dominate the agenda. We saw this in the third plenum that was held in July last year, where the overarching economic blueprint that the party set out for the next 5 years, I would argue very much was framed against a backdrop of geopolitical tensions, right? The overarching goal is to shift China towards a more self-reliant footing and to emphasize high-tech manufacturing, to emphasize independence in technological innovation, and the catchphrase of these new productive forces, and to shift China away from an earlier reliance on a property and debt-fueled growth model. To do that would have been difficult enough, but to do that in the midst of current economic weakness is extremely hard. And so we saw from September last year, the Chinese government start to talk a lot more about stimulus, right? The Central Economic Work Committee that met in December pushed a higher priority for increasing the role of consumption in China's growth, in China's economic policies. So you start to see the relative balance between security and development shift a little bit more towards development, until the second Trump administration was sworn in last month, right? And since then, we have had 10% tariffs imposed on China. So that's 10% on top of the existing tariffs that were levied back in the first Trump administration, the Investment Policy Act that I mentioned earlier, and these vague discussions of maybe the two sides would have a deal or not have a deal. But it's a far more unstable environment. And so China is back now having to decide, what do we mean by coordinating security and development? Will we see a shift of the pendulum back towards emphasizing security, even amidst the current weakness in the Chinese economy? It's a very open question. So these are some of the dynamics that I'm trying to sort through in my own head right now. So thank you.
Great, great. Thank you very much for that really comprehensive synopsis of several different aspects of economic security. Right now, though, I want to also welcome to the panel our other panelists joining us today. Yu Jie from Chatham House. Are you ready?
Yes.
If you're all ready, she's fresh from the station, but ready to speak. I'll invite her to speak for a little bit about whatever she likes on this general topic of geopolitics in China over the last year or so.
Right, okay. Please forgive me. I've been extremely late, and because I was so confident that I know the town back to 20 years ago when I studied here, but now obviously I got lost completely, so lost with the track in here. But please forgive me, and I'm sure Ellen has Yeling explained to you all the excellent views regarding the political economy, which I followed her work and Bill's work very closely. Now, where are we? I think we're now really in that very critical juncture regarding how China positioned itself domestically, but that also directly affected how China positioned itself internationally simultaneously at the same time. Now, I mean, when we're talking about how China projecting its power and influence globally, and the three words come to my mind. It all began with the word of letter M. So obviously, China is able to using its enormous financial resources, which is money, to extend this sense of political influence, like what David Blackman was talking about back to 1948, the sense of economic statecraft that China is doing to extend its global influence and particularly pivot towards developing countries, pivot towards global south. Now, the second sense of M in here is that sense of might, is that sense of the negative sense of economic statecraft. It's not just about foreign direct investment. It's not just about development assistance that China is producing to the global south, but equally, China began to more prone to use the sense of export control. China is more able to using that sense of trade coercion with the part of the global north, with most of the G7 countries, as what have we seen in the past, that sense of tit for tat on the trade war between United States and China. In the previous term was Donald Trump. Now, that's the M, but also that sense of military might that Beijing began to strengthen its muscle and more prone to use in the regional flashpoint, both in the South China Sea and also around Taiwan Strait. So that sense of a military might that China has enabled itself to extend it to. Now, the third M in here is the sense of mindset that China is essentially keen to challenge, but also essentially keen to preserve at the same time. So it's a quite a bit ambivalence in here. The sense of mindset, that is to say, China obviously rather dissatisfied with the so-called liberal international order. Whether it actually exists or not after this week, we don't know. That's another question over here. But obviously, with that sense of the mindset, what China has been keep doing the past decade or at least past 2 decades or so is a sense of reforming the existing international and multilateral organizations for China's own benefit, for China's own preferences. So, for example, if we were talking about World Bank and IMF and what China has been doing, it is really to adding the chairs on the table, expanding its voting shares with IMF, expanding its voting shares within the World Bank, expanding the key personnels on the decision-making bodies of the UN agencies in order to ensure China's preferences being represented. So that sense of changing mindset, but also rally the large part of developing countries by using the existing money to influence the mindset of those global south countries. So that sense of China has been practiced quite well within the international organizations. So the 3 sets of that really put China, I think this is real sense of also fits into how United States extending its global influence and achieving its global ambition. But I think that could be widely applied for any great power But I think for the sense of China, the two what we have seen so far, the mindset is there and the money is there, but whether this might will be able to continue. Now, the trouble comes from, I'm sure Yeling touched earlier regarding the domestic economic downturn and how this linked to China's foreign policy. So in the past 2 decades or so, China's engagement with the large part of developing countries are mostly based on a spending spree on the international, by building infrastructure, building the physical infrastructure to many global south countries in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. So all that tied together through the Belt and Road Initiative. But I think really given the recent years, given the criticisms that has been attracted by the Belt and Road Initiative, but also given the economic downturn that China had domestically, so it will be incredibly difficult for Beijing to be able to extend the sense of spending spree that Beijing has been operate in the past decades or so. And instead, what would be the new solution for China's continuous engagement with the Global South? And we don't really have the clear answer yet. Now, secondly, after America's sudden U-turn, by getting on very well with currently the best friend, Vladimir Putin, and what China would do by invested so much on this bilateral relationship between Beijing and Moscow. So Beijing feels that sense of remain quite conflicted. On the one hand, yes, it would like to view through the lenses of the great power competition between China and the United States, and hence Russia would be part of the answer of that sense of counterbalance. And China's engagement with Russia are largely fixated not on this war, but largely fixated because of the long-term rivalry, the protracted rivalry that China has with the United States, and hence Russia would be able to bring some sense of counterbalance for that. But nevertheless, and what if this be another sense of US and Russia rapprochement, and China feel conflicted, it does not want to be trapped by Kremlin's this total confrontation towards the West on the one hand, but on the other hand, China does not want to irritate its the biggest nuclear neighbor. So what to do diplomatically? And well, simultaneously, I'm sure sooner or later, after Donald Trump managed to find a peace settlement regarding war in Ukraine, and they will refocus on its priority of competing with China, and what China will do. And the answer is very unclear for now. But I think one thing is very clear, really judging from the various policy that Beijing has produced for now, that how much the box of foreign policy is really linked back to its domestic economy. I know a lot of people have been questioning about what is happening on China's property market and what is happening on Chinese economy. I think the question in here is, and also I think the upstairs in Beijing has been quite clear. It is a policy-induced economic slowdown. And in order to build a country, and especially an economic system that is able to withstand the economic and the geopolitical shock produced by the United States. And for example, part of the reason why Beijing has begun to abandon the property sector, but instead by investing money in the strategically important sector, such as semiconductors, such as AI, is precisely because they know ultimately, if we're going to have a final showdown between China and the United States, it relies on the technology competition. And that sense of technology competition will not give Beijing any physical space to reduce the tax and try to encouraging more consumption among the household at home. So this all comes back to China-US competition in order to building an economic system that can withstand geopolitical pressure. So that sense of pursuit of economic self-reliance and that sense of pursuit of technology self-reliance, that is also linked into what we have in here, where's the current shape of the Chinese economy today. So for those of you who keep asking me, are we going to see an economic stimulus package that's been issued by Beijing next week during the National People's Congress? And the clear answer is no. And you will not see the same level of whatever economic stimulus being offered by Beijing, but instead, you will see Beijing will double down its scientific and innovation budget, And you see Beijing double down its defense budget, really because Beijing felt the world was getting worse, but not necessarily getting better. So that also reminds me, a couple of European diplomats asked me last night, I went to one event last night, asked me, so why Beijing has decided to sitting on this position on the war in Ukraine? I think partially that sense of neutrality, the so-called pro-Russia neutrality, is partially to do with Russia. I think that's also partially to do with the mentality of the Chinese leaders. That is to say, you cannot rely on anyone. The alliance system will not work because Beijing has learned a mistake back to 70 years ago during the Sino-Soviet split. So the split between Chinese Communist Party and the Soviet Communist Party. So that sense of alliance that Beijing has entered in the early phase of 1950 and somehow really did not work for China at all. So I think that really lesson to be learned back to several decades ago and led Beijing into the choices of non-alliance but alignment with Russia. And hence, but where are we? We don't know where the world we're leading, but it's all in the total chaos for now. But I think for now, it seems to be Beijing will keep a very cool distance to leaving the US and the Russians and the Europeans to sort out what they need to sort out, but instead spending much time in research and innovation on enabling itself to compete with the United States in the much longer term.
Great, thank you very much. Before opening the floor for questions and discussion, let me just say one or two things, sort of talking about some of the points raised by both speakers, and then also on what I think Jonathan Sullivan might have talked about had he been able to join us today. So on that rather speculative note, if we think about China's domestic economy and the difficulties that it's facing, part of this has much deeper roots, I think, than just the last few years, and actually doesn't have much to do with economic security as a discourse. A lot of this goes back to the economic model that powered very high rates of GDP growth, with, albeit, significant amounts of social dislocation and disruption to key economic sectors and regions from about 1994 to 2008. After 2008 and the economic crisis worldwide, that growth model based on high investment and high exports basically broke down. It hasn't really been able to deliver now for nearly 20 years. Certainly not the way that it did before. And that fact was not lost on Chinese leaders and planners. As early as at least the early months of 2010, I remember being at a conference in Beijing and hearing an economist from what used to be called the State Planning Commission, it's now the Development and Reform Commission, say very explicitly two things. First, for us right now, the United States is too big to fail. So we didn't really have a choice but to buy lots of US government bonds in the aftermath of the crisis, even though it was a suboptimal policy for China's domestic economy. And that was something that wasn't, it appeared, an aspect that he was pleased about of the relationship, right? So it was important to sort of get out from under this dependency on bilateral trade with the United States. But the second thing that I thought was much more insightful was that China can no longer depend on export processing manufacturing to fuel economic growth, right? That was recognized at least by that point, and I would argue actually quite a bit earlier, as early as 2005, 2006, really. So certainly by 2010. And then if we look at the Made in China 2025 plan that came out not long after that, it was very explicit about saying investment is too high, consumption is too low, and our sectors are concentrated too far at the lower end of the value-added continuum. So what we need to do is invest in technology and innovation, move to higher value-added sectors, increase incomes and wages, and increase domestic consumption to depend less on exports, and particularly less on exports to the US and Europe. What has happened since then is a failure of the policy, I would say, to really reorient the domestic economy. There's still way too much investment. Much of that is increasingly fueled by bad debts in the public sector and also in the private economy. It crowds out more productive investment that might come, or more productive credit access actually, or access to credit for more productive investment that might otherwise be there. and it crowds out consumption, right? So the weakness of China's domestic economy today, I think, is driven fundamentally by low demand, low consumption, not necessarily by a failure of the government to provide enough stimulus. And in fact, the only way out of the malaise that China has found itself in post-COVID, as agreed, in fact, by many people inside the Chinese government and many sort of policy commentators and observers, inside China as well as outside, would be, in fact, a structural reform of the economy, such that consumption would take a much stronger role, investment would go down as a share of the overall GDP, and more innovation would take place, et cetera, et cetera. That would also entail somehow dealing with this tremendous problem of excessive debt. And in the short term, carries a very high risk of a severe recession or even worse. And so the dilemma, I think, for the Chinese government since 2015, when we first saw that big downturn in the stock market and in property, has really been trying to figure out which policy is the safer one. The long-term objective of reducing debt, winding down the housing bubble, and undertaking structural reform, or shorter-term government spending, open access to credit, write-downs of debt rather than actual paying down debt, and allowing the economy to continue growing. And so I think there's a recognition that the second makes the first harder. If we think about China's integration with the global south and with other countries, I actually would differ about the One Belt, One Road policy. I think One Belt, One Road was a very convenient shingle to hang on a lot of other stuff, right? It was very easy to do outbound investment if you could call it part of One Belt, One Road. And it was very difficult to do so if you couldn't, for quite some time. I think since 2022, that policy is basically dead. It wasn't mentioned.
2019 even.
Yes, exactly.
Even a bit earlier.
Exactly.
2019.
Yes, I mean, it's still going in a couple of countries, notably Pakistan and Indonesia. There still are important One Belt, One Road investments in those countries. But yeah, essentially they're out of money by that point, and there's not really a lot being continued to be committed after that. And it no longer has quite the convenience for others looking to do outbound investment. But if we look at other areas of trade, China's number one trading relationship now, as I always say, is no longer with the European Union, but with ASEAN. And that isn't about One Belt, One Road. That's actually about a comprehensive free trade agreement that's been there now for more than 10 years, and that's actually borne tremendous fruit in terms of fueling overall trade and economic growth in both those areas, which complicates the picture for Southeast Asian countries' relations with the United States as well as with China, et cetera, which we can get into in the next panel. But I think it's important to think about that as well as just this sort of policy-driven, security-driven objective of increasing trade. It's not just that. Trade also increases organically, but with different parts of the world than had been there before. In terms of Russia and the United States, the old famous triangle, I have no idea what's really going on there, but if I had to guess, I think Trump is trying to play what we could call a reverse Nixon, right? What he's trying to do is improve relations, if he's thinking about China in this triangular way at all, is improve relations with Russia in order to outflank China. If that's the case, the logic would be, I think, that if the United States improves its relationship with Russia, Russia is no longer the reliable balancer against US power from China's point of view. China then fears being isolated against all the Western powers without Russia as the real balancer, and China will then have to move to be less confrontational with the United States or the West. That would be the logic under that, I think. Part of what's also happening, though, not having to do directly with Russia, is that if the United States is a less reliable ally to Japan, Japan is faced with a strategic dilemma. Does Japan rearm in a much more comprehensive way? China doesn't really like that prospect particularly. Or does Japan try to improve its relationship and reduce tensions with China in response to the US being perhaps less reliable as a security partner? I think that China is going to try, and is indeed already trying, to decrease its tension with Japan and to improve the relationship between China and Japan in order to incentivize Japan not to rearm as strongly and maybe to push Japan just a little bit away from the US orbit, which I don't think is going to happen, but maybe there could be a little bit of daylight opened in that. So then to talk very briefly about what I think Jonathan Sullivan would have talked about, I think he would have focused largely on Taiwan, because this is, after all, the Greater China panel, not just Mainland China. And if we think about what's happened in Taiwan over the last year, the absolutely key event is the presidential election, the election of President Lai Ching-te, who had been the vice president for Tsai Ing-wen before that. So the Democratic Progressive Party maintains its hold on the presidency, but at the same time, there also took place legislative elections for the Li Faiyuan. No party won a majority in those elections, but what happened was that the Kuomintang, the previous ruling party from long ago, got the largest number of seats. And the third party that contested the presidential election as well, this Taiwan People's Party, or TPP, got enough seats such that they could play a kind of kingmaker role. And they decided to side with the Kuomintang, the KMT. And that means effectively that the legislature has been dominated by the opposition. Now, why is that important? Because they have tried to stymie and successfully stymied a lot of what the Lai administration has tried to do, both in terms of domestic spending priorities on the budget and in terms of foreign policy. And so it's, to a certain degree at least, hamstrung the president who's come in presiding over a divided government at a moment of potential crisis. Why is there a potential crisis for Taiwan? Well, a couple of things. First of all, Taiwan's economy has done rather well over the last number of years, even as almost all other major economies in the world have done relatively much more poorly. But it is not obvious that that run of good fortune will continue. And so how does one ensure that Taiwan's economy continues to grow or to do well? It's sort of an open question, but what if it doesn't? Especially at a moment where budgets are being held up, there's a big question over how much more can be committed to defense. There are questions about sort of export markets of high-tech products and whether that can continue as unfettered as it has in the past, and all kinds of other issues. A second area is, of course, the way that China might respond to various political situations in Taiwan. I actually don't think that's at a very high level of crisis, but there is concern, and I think warranted concern, in Taiwan about how to manage the relationship with the mainland. What may or may not provoke stronger or weaker responses from the mainland side. And then the third aspect, obviously, is the United States. I think there's a consensus in Taipei that Taiwan knows fairly well how to manage the US relationship, even with Trump, even in the second administration, but I don't think that's a consensus of complete confidence. There is certainly some concern that the US may be less reliable than it has been in the past as a protector of Taiwan's security. Just yesterday, there was a report that Trump walked back, actually, Biden's interpretation of the second clause of the Taiwan Relations Act and said that the US may not actually defend Taiwan, or he wouldn't commit to saying that the US would defend Taiwan in the event of an actual war. That is obviously somewhat disconcerting if you're sitting in Taiwan. It's not as clear as it had been what the US position will be. And I think underlying this is a general fear that Trump likes to make deals, as he keeps saying, right? He wants to make a deal with Russia, maybe he'll make a deal with China. If he makes a deal with China, where does that leave Taiwan? Obviously not in a very good place if you're the Taiwan government or in the national security sphere in Taiwan. So Taiwan is at this moment of sort of uncertainty internationally, just as it is also at this moment of sort of domestic political incoherence and confrontation or internal conflict within the state. So it's a bit of a difficult moment for Taiwan in that respect, and those are the main outlines. In terms of which relationships are important besides US and China, obviously for Taiwan, Japan and Southeast Asia are also key in different ways. And I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A or about any of the other things, but let's now open it up to any questions or comments from anyone in the audience.
Can you briefly comment on, yes, Ying Jin, University of Cambridge. Can you briefly comment on the Korean Peninsula? Because that's not mentioned so far. So I just wondered, because the rest of that actually, it's very, very helpful. But if you could comment on that, would be good.
Great. Let's take maybe 3 questions and then we can answer them. Is there any other?
I actually have 2 questions, but anyway, for the first, it's just like, can you just evaluate more about the China's Belt and Road Initiative? Some arguments say it has already proved that it's not that helpful to China's domestic economy and not that helpful to outsiders. It's country sponsored, but some argue it's still ongoing, and like Xi Jinping administration is still pushing that. So can you elaborate on that? And if it failed, when is it? And if it's not failed, and how is it going on?
Hello, I'm Cindy. My question is about what is your opinion on how this kind of Chinese influence is going to affect the UK economy?
One last question, maybe, before we...
Harriet Hannibal, and I am going to ask a climate question, but it's not always climate from me. If you could expand on whether there is any certainty or clarity in the direction coming from China with regard to climate policy, given the changes from Trump. Thank you.
Okay. Who would like to go first? Do you want to go first? We can go in the same order that we were on the panel.
Sure. Can I respond to your comments
course.
first? Because your comments, Bill, were excellent and very thought-provoking. So I wanted to share some reactions to the first part of your comments, discussing quite accurately, I think, China's movement and shift between different economic models, going back all the way back to the early 1990s. And each economic model has produced its own source of distortions and its own sources of instability, right? So the export-led model basically generates a set of vulnerabilities to collapses in global demand, as we saw in the global financial crisis. The response then was to shift to this domestic investment, property-led, debt-led growth model, mostly from local governments, that has generated financial risk, hidden risk, and massive debt problems from the local economy. And China is at a crossroads now. And I agree with you on the domestic debate going on within China on there's a group of people who think, look, the only way we shift to a more sustainable economic footing is to go through a real valley of painful recession and restructuring. That's the only way, right? And there's another group who thinks we need to get through this, that it will be too costly, right? And that some kind of short-term stimulus is necessary, right, for a range of reasons. Social stability being possibly one of those reasons. And I would nevertheless layer upon that a new concern over security that has reshaped economic policy in China today. Because for many decades, China's economic growth models, whichever one it chose, was premised upon the assumption that the overall geopolitical situation would be stable. I think there were a few turning points, right, both domestically and externally. Externally, I went back to 2014 earlier. I didn't mention that there was another external shock during that time, which was the Snowden revelations, right, about the scale of surveillance that the US government was engaging in, sometimes through private companies. That had a fairly substantial impact domestically in China in terms of how China viewed the vulnerabilities of its reliance on foreign technology. I have a paper coming out it's co-authored with Mark Dallas, Henry Farrell, and Abe Newman, where we track this shift in concern by doing some very basic text analysis of over 500,000 articles related to science and technology. And we see a clear jump during the 6-month period where the Snowden leaks were kind of dripping out through the news of a heightened concern over technology security, information security. Shortly after that, we saw the Xi Jinping administration establish a cybersecurity commission within the Central Committee, and then supported by an administration, and bureaucratic restructuring to refocus that, right? So many of the original concerns over reliance on foreign technology became very salient from 2014 onwards. And it gave, I would argue, the central government a way to refocus the energies of a fairly fragmented innovation system, a fairly fragmented bureaucratic system that governed information security at that point in time, and shifted towards a much more centralized bureaucracy. We see some parallels from 2018 onwards with the worsening of US-China relations. And we can see that again in terms of bureaucratic restructuring and policies and laws, right? So in 2020, China very quickly put forward an export control law, right? It took them some years to enact the implementing regulations. 4 years later, the implementing regulations were put out. It established the unreliable entity list that sat dormant for a number of years. Now there are over a dozen companies on the unreliable entity list. It has, in the past 5 years, also developed a list for the export controls on dual-use items, export controls on the limitations on the export of technologies. And it's starting to slowly use many of these policies and to put flesh on the bones of what used to be just laws and regulations that sat there on paper but were not very much deployed into action. Now we're seeing the Chinese government deploy many of these new laws and regulations, a new central commission on governing science and technology, right? Again, a restructuring, centralization of political control over the science and technology governance system. I don't think these specific types of changes would have occurred without there being a far greater concern about security vulnerabilities in China's growth model. So that doesn't negate anything you said. I completely agree. I think there's layered upon that this other dimension that makes the transition to a demand-led, consumption-led economy even more difficult, right? Because that type of consumption-led economy is not one that's resilient to geopolitical shocks. So it's really just reinforcing the dilemma that.
And then you wouldn't have the physical space to be able to allow more consumption. I mean, I think the dilemma, one of the dilemmas, so while I was in Beijing in December, one of the discussion was, can we actually producing more personal tax reduction in order to allow more consumption? But the problem is, if all your financial resources really pivot into strategically important sector, without allowing you to have the extra stimulus or extra subsidies to encouraging consumption, and where the consumption will come from. But nevertheless, I think Beijing has chose very decisively go down through the national security path. I mean, the security concern which you're referring to.
Yeah, and I think the sort of hand gestures towards the importance of consumption that we saw in the December Central Economic Work Meeting, when you look at the concrete specifics, they were fairly shallow, I would say, right? So one set of policies were about giving rebates to buy new appliances or trade in your vehicle sooner rather than later. All that does is to move future consumption forward, right? It doesn't actually do anything to shift the overall share of consumption in the economy on a long-term basis, right? Because if I buy a new car today rather than in 5 years' time, that just means in 5 years' time I'm not buying a new car. The ideas of this debut economy, right? So sort of short-term sales, by online sales and discounts and so on, very fleeting, right? The ice and snow economy. So looking at the Winter Olympics and looking at winter sports as a new source of consumption for people. Again, highly marginal, right? There's no fundamental shift towards consumption.
Any of the questions you want to? No. Any of the questions you want to answer over there? I think we have a Korean Peninsula BRI influence. And any questions you would like to pick down?
I can touch on climate and the BRI, but I'll let you elaborate on the BRI. On climate, I think it's been China's overall climate policies have been, from the Chinese perspective, quite ambitious, and from the American perspective, insufficient to make an impact. And the two basically are talking past each other. And I think China's climate policy has become politicized on the point of electric vehicle exports, particularly to Europe and North America. And this is a rather frustrating situation, because when one country raises tariffs on electric vehicles, what it basically does is to push Chinese exports towards other countries that have yet to raise their tariffs, right? And so that leads to a higher surge than under the scenario where had there been no tariffs. And so you see countries being frustrated with each other. It's like, why are you raising tariffs? You're just driving the EVs to my market. And the concern, which is not an invalid one, is that domestic manufacturers are unable to keep up with the sheer scale of it. Right. I disagree with the argument that China's competitiveness in electric vehicles has been due purely to subsidies distorting the playing field. I think there's a whole lot of really excellent innovation that has driven the success of its EV vehicles. Right. And this was the one contribution that China could have made to the climate picture. Not just in terms of the vehicles themselves, but the approach that the Chinese government took to make EVs a success domestically, which was really a multifaceted picture, right? It took, yes, government intervention, but not purely in the subsidy space. I mean, the subsidy space is almost moot if you consider that every single local government was putting subsidies in, right? So there's no difference between my company and your company. We're both getting subsidies, and we're both competing ferociously with each other. Where government intervention had an impact was in driving consumer demand for EVs rather than diesel engines, right? By saying, if you want to buy a diesel engine, you'll have to wait a year. If you want to buy an EV, you can get one next week, right? I'm just stylizing it. And building the charging infrastructure, which is the role of governments, right? It's something that private sectors don't do very well. Private sector firms don't do very well. And it's a thing that again and again we see in many consumer markets outside of China hinders the purchasing of an EV, right? If range anxiety, right? I don't know where I can charge my car, so I won't buy an electric vehicle. That problem China tackled very effectively by building out a strong infrastructure for charging. So it was really a holistic set of policies that made electric vehicles take off in China. And the rest of the world, I think, missed an opportunity to learn from that. And we've missed an opportunity for China to really contribute to the green transition, because the issue has become very politicized, and as I mentioned in my opening remarks, filtered through this lens of predation, right? Chinese EVs are a predatory threat now in some governments' eyes. So that's, I think, really unfortunate. I'll let you speak on the BRI because I've
Sure,
spoken
okay.
too much.
Well, to go through, obviously, Korean Peninsula, we haven't covered this. I think one of the very interesting elements in here, we should always remember that even though we seem to have the impression that China and North Korea are somehow that indispensable between two countries, But the way how they describe their bilateral relations in the past, they use the term lip and teeth. But I think that really need some reconsideration and reevaluation in here. Ever since President Xi came to power, and ever since Kim Jong-un came to power, and there has never been a proper state visit between the two countries. So, which is very unusual, I mean, for China and North Korea. That's one thing. Now, secondly, I mean, myself, for working in a think tank in the West, I mean, by no way being a fly on the wall in Zhongnanhai, I can't really judge what in the mindset of President Xi. But what I can read is really the statement that the two sides have been put forward to, back to commemorating the 70 years anniversary and 75 years anniversary of the diplomatic relations between the two countries. Now, back to 2019, the statement was much longer and much warmer from Beijing, and with a sense of really embracing sense of romance, you know, the brotherhood relationship between each other. And however, I think really back to 2024 last year, and particularly after there's been a sense of military alliance between Moscow and Pyongyang, and Beijing feels certainly alarmed by it. And then obviously the answer and the statement issued by Beijing become much colder and much shorter. And the way how Beijing described its relationship with DPRK is, in a sense, we do hope to pursue a normal bilateral relations between China and North Korea. I mean, the term of normal really for me has been quite a significant downgrade and has been quite significance of annoyance has been showed from Xi Jinping's side. So that is one layer of the story. Now, the second layer of the story in here is we're now going to facing a very influx sense of South Korea, and we don't know yet, and who will be the next South Korean president. And surely with the previous impeached president, President Yoon, and has pursued more of the very closer American alliance policy. But instead, and if we're going to have another president, and which seems to be likely within the opposition, and that might pursue a closer to Beijing policy. So far, I think what we have seen so far, Beijing realized the difficulties in terms of handling Donald Trump. So what Beijing began to do instead is not a charm offense towards Europe, but rather, come back to what we said earlier, improving its relationship with Japan, improving its relationship with South Korea, and also improving its relationship with India. So working through China's neighbors, and that is one element of it. But are we going to see a much closer China, South Korea, and Japan relations? And the clear answer is, again, depends how United States play a role in here. So I think overall, the likely consequences for the Korean Peninsula in the next decade or so, I mean, to have a nuclear risk is there, and it's not necessarily escalating, but because this largely really depends on how the other external powers and play in the hands of the Korean Peninsula. It's not really to be determined by North Korea itself, but really determined by how the nature and how the evolving nature of North Korea's relations with Beijing, with United States, and with Russia, and with Japan, and with South Korea. I think in particular, if we're going to see another round of rapprochement between DPRK, between North Korea and United States, again, this will make China feel deeply uncomfortable. So I think we're now in a very ambivalent situation regarding Korean Peninsula for now. For the Belt and Road Initiative, Bill, I think I entirely agree with you. I mean, I don't think there's any differences in here. Part of the Belt and Road, it is not exactly a grand strategy of extending China's global influence. I think there's an element of that, but there's also an element of the sense of political campaign within China and how the central government is able to mobilize the domestic economic resources, but there's also partially a tool for the 34 different provinces and cities of China that enable to cut big chunk of the central budget in order to benefit for its own local region. Because at the end of the day, while we're talking about the resources allocation within China, I think if you have 34 different cooks in one soup, and then you probably wouldn't know how the taste of soup looks like. I mean, certainly won't taste very good. So that is precisely the analogy that's what we have with the Belt and Road Initiative. Within too many stakeholders get involved domestically, and hence begin to somehow lose the direction of travel. So that's part of the reason I think Beijing also dialed it down. And I mean, what I've noticed that the reason why I'm saying 2019 was really during the second BRI forum from May 2019 that Beijing has not pledged any state funding. So no any fresh state capital has been pledged ever since May 2019 to supporting the Belt and Road. But instead was much hoping the state-owned enterprises and whoever the stakeholders that have participated in BRI and to put money in themselves, into financing, to looking for money, so looking for fundings for themselves. So that really a very significant step of downgrade in here. And again, if you compare with the 19th Party Congress and the 20th Party Congress and the two significant political events of China, and they usually will produce a very lengthy political report. And within those political report, you'll be able to gauge which are the policy priorities. Back to 2017, during the 19th Party Congress, the section on the Belt and Road is 2 paragraphs. 2 paragraphs may sound very short for you, but really for that kind of political blueprint document, 2 paragraphs is exceedingly long. Whereas if we can come back to 2022, during the 20th Party Congress, the mention of the BRI is only half of the sentence. So that just really indicates to you how much this priority has really been downgraded. I think this is also compounded by the challenge of COVID-19, that many of the operations that was in China has largely operated under very poor conditions in most of the developing countries. So it will become exceedingly difficult for Beijing to be able to sustain that level of financial support, to be able to complete the project in time. And that actually led into the sense of waste and delay. Now, really to answer your question regarding how this BRI could benefit domestic Chinese people, but not necessarily benefiting for the other external stakeholders, I think even the Chinese are questioning. So if we're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, that Beijing's idea to have, it is to reducing the domestic overcapacity in terms of building physical infrastructures. But as we know, building infrastructures in a foreign country, and that would require planning, would require permission, and that would also equally require the labor force to be able, the local community to be able to cooperate. But I mean, all the plans that Beijing has is the plan A, is assuming the project will go ahead and go smoothly, go with a green light, and no haphazard, no zigzag. But instead, what we have, in most of the scenarios, and most of the projects are delayed, and some of the money being wasted, and some of the resources are being wasted. So instead of reducing the overcapacity, it's actually added and increased the sense of overcapacity. So it does not really necessarily help the economy as a whole. But nevertheless, I mean, as I said earlier, it is a narrative power that Beijing is able to play on the table. So last year I was in Brussels, and I was asking someone who covered the European infrastructure programs, covered European Global Gateway, the one that referred by European Union, saying how ready you are, in terms of competing with China. And many of them offer me a very elusive answer saying, yes, we have a document there, but to having document is one thing, but having the actual resources to be able to invest it in is another. So I think until we have a new sense of infrastructure development system program, I think the Belt and Road and also China's Global Development Initiative and so on and so forth will be the only one remain in town for now. So I think it's really entirely up to the external stakeholders, the recipient countries, which have signed up the Belt and Road, to be able to provide ask to Beijing and what do they want to do. And also, again, the problem in here is that once Beijing has created a sense of perception that it has the resources to help the Global South, but what if, as I said earlier, because of the economic slowdown, I mean, I think it's the perception that we already had China was able to help, but how about if those perceptions are fixated, but China won't be able to help anymore because of its domestic downturn? And then are we going to foresee a sense of backlash and backfire from many of the developing countries that initially support China internationally? So that is the biggest unknown. Really, for me, we haven't really yet calculated the medium-term consequences of China's economic slowdown really towards the global south. Not just the global north, but really to the global south for the sake of development in here. Now, answer your question on China's influence to the UK economy, frankly, it's very little. I think part of the reason why the two countries had such a difficult relationship in the past few years is precisely because the economic complementarity with each other are so little. And because UK is not producing things that China want to buy. You won't buy Jaguar every day. You won't buy Aston Martin every day, right? What China has offered to the UK seems to be also very little at the same time. So I think the influence with both countries remain very minimal. I think that's also the core reason that the bilateral relations won't improve that quickly at all. I mean, if you look into the UK's FDI, who is the UK's largest FDI destination? It's the United States, it's European Union, it's not China. So no matter, I know how hard the City of London is trying to making that argument. I know how hard the Chinese stay on the banks in here try to making the argument saying how close the two countries are. But I'm afraid because of the particular economic structures of both countries, and that really determined the two countries won't be as close as, for example, like Germany or France as in continental Europe. It's just the nature of the fact over there. Yeah.
Okay, great. Just very briefly to try to speak to some of these questions. If we think about well, first actually on this topic of sort of the strategy for China in terms of this dilemma of whether to engage in structural reform or stimulus, I think there has emerged a kind of compromise position over time, particularly over about the last 7 or 8 years. And that compromise position basically says, so if it's possible to grow fast enough for long enough, it might just be feasible for China to kind of grow its way out of all of the various economic problems and contradictions. So just as China supposedly grew its way out of the plan in the 1980s to early 1990s, many would then look at China supposedly, again, growing its way out of the various problems of the state-owned economy and agriculture and other sectors in the 90s to mid-2000s boom. Maybe China can grow its way out of the debt bubbles and the other problems that are there in the post-2008 world. And that sort of slower resolution to the problem, driven by the cushion or aided by the cushion of this very high growth in a sustained way, could actually be a way forward. It's not the obvious way forward. Most other countries, most of the time, have sort of looked at this as a dilemma, but maybe there's this kind of third way. And I think that's sort of where Chinese policy has settled repeatedly since about 2015, 2016. We could talk a lot more about cybersecurity law and other interesting aspects of data security, but to stick with these questions, I think on Korean Peninsula, and I agree completely with what Yu Jie has said about North Korea and the relationship there, and also about China's intention probably to improve the somewhat fraught security relationship with South Korea. China, remember, already though has an extraordinarily important and positive economic relationship with South Korea. And the aspect of this that often gets lost in China, but also in third countries looking at that, is the fact that the security relationship inside Korea is very much politicized. Right? It's become a kind of left-right cleavage, such that right-wing parties and governments want a more confrontational security stance towards China and closer collaboration with the United States. More left-wing governments want a more conciliatory policy towards China and potentially at least a little bit of a renegotiation of some of the very, very close ties with the United States, particularly when it comes to security. And so the current domestic political crisis and likely transition to a different governing coalition in South Korea probably means that South Korea is likely to move in a less confrontational direction vis-a-vis China when it comes to security, unless we're all completely wrong about what we think is going to come from the next election. And part of the problem of President Yun and the martial law declaration and so on was indeed that he overplayed the hand of confrontation with China and closeness to the United States, even in his martial law declaration, and subsequently asserting that there was an imminent threat from North Korea and China, and that it was necessary to be close to the US and to have martial law to make sure that that alliance was not in any way compromised. Right? I don't think it was therefore a coincidence that some of his supporters, when they surrounded his residence, were waving US flags and you know, appeared to be sort of Trumpian in many ways. Yes, they were, but not just that. It was also a political mobilization of this US alliance. So with regard to One Belt, One Road, what I would also point out there, One Belt, One Road was undertaken, yes, to get rid of overcapacity, but also to offshore unproductive investment. Right? China's return on investment at the aggregate level is one of the lowest in the world. And looking at the world 15 years ago, it seemed one possible solution was to offshore this unproductive investment, put it in other countries and see what happens. Put it in riskier countries where you might get a higher return, right? The level of risk is high, so maybe that these projects don't even work, but they weren't working at home anyway. They're already losing money, right? So put them in another country where the risk is higher, you might actually make more money. And then also try to focus all of this investment into particular areas in Southeast Asia and Central Asia especially, where China was intent on trying to cultivate soft power, right, and project kind of a soft power image. I would argue that it was a spectacular failure on both counts, because almost all of the One Belt, One Road projects that I'm at all aware of or have seen any kind of data about didn't make money. Pretty much from the beginning, they all lost money, as far as I know. I mean, I'm sure there are outliers, and somebody could bring one up, but I'm pretty sure almost all of them were losing money from very early on and continued to lose more and more and more and more money. The second thing is that if you look at a lot of polling data and other kind of public opinion research in countries across Central Asia and Southeast Asia, when there were large One Belt, One Road investments and initiatives, the public perception of China did not improve and in many cases got worse, right? So as far as soft power went, it had kind of a negative impact. It was too ham-fisted and brute force kind of soft power. It didn't win over lots of friends. It provoked acrimonious debates in some countries' politics, like Malaysia and Thailand, even Indonesia, right? So this kind of initiative didn't really work that well, that way. And now we see sort of at the back end other problems with it. So I really do think it's pretty much over. What is going to be much more important looking ahead, besides the kind of organic trade relationships that I tried to emphasize before, are other kinds of investment initiatives driven much more by other sorts of economic imperatives, right? For example, in mining resources of particular kinds, or in food production of particular kinds, right? To try to get access to particular markets or to not exploit necessarily, but to develop particular kinds of resources that exist in other countries. If we think about impact on the UK economy, I agree with Yijie again. Basically, the impact will be fairly small, but not altogether negligible. And the main impact, I would say, is going to be twofold. First of all, in terms of exports both that the UK likes to bring in from China and exports that maybe the UK is less interested in bringing in large quantities or more worried about bringing in. A shift in what gets exported or how much aggregate exports there are would have impact on the UK economy in at least some sectors, not least green technology, EVs, et cetera, which I can come back to in a second. The second aspect of this is going to be in terms of gains not realized, right? So I think this really comes down to another issue we haven't talked about if we think about Greater China, which is Hong Kong. And if and when and this is a tremendous if, because I'm not sure this is even on the table at all or ever going to be feasible, but I think it's vitally important that it be thought about and talked about. If and when some kind of, I don't want to say solution, but modus vivendi can be formulated vis-a-vis Hong Kong between China and the UK, right? If China and the UK can ever get past the essential impasse that exists over Hong Kong right now, that potentially opens the door to key sectors where I think the UK has a great deal of global market share and potentially comparative advantage when it comes to trade in China, and there's a tremendous potential growth in those areas, particularly things like banking, insurance, shipping, and media and publishing. So I think that in Hong Kong itself, there are tremendous gains to be realized if and when this current impasse were to be moved past, but also in mainland China, probably even more so. And so there's a potential tremendous gain to the British economy from resolution of this other issue. But the Hong Kong issue is by no means easy to resolve and may not be resolvable. But I worry, actually, that it does not seem to be at the top of the agenda or the front of everyone's mind when the British government looks at talking to China. Whatever the British position is going to be, however they might try to approach this issue, I don't think Hong Kong is the first thing that anyone in the British government is thinking about when they think about China. And I think it probably should be, at least one of the very first, if not the first. And it just isn't clear that that's the case. It may be, I don't know, but it doesn't appear to be. Finally then, on climate and green technology, if we look at China's climate strategy when it comes to manufacturing, as well as its overall strategy in many new sectors when it comes to manufacturing, and the climate strategy is very heavily about manufacturing, precisely because there's a necessity to increase overall employment and to open up enough employment to absorb the new entrants into the labor force, if possible. The strategy has been to sort of balance the three objectives that most innovators usually go for in a particular way. And those three objectives are basically cost, efficiency, and durability, right? You can produce new technology that is extremely efficient but ridiculously expensive or very fragile, and no one's going to buy it, right? What you want to produce is something that balances those in a way that the market will want to absorb that. And so the strategy in China is partially driven by government incentives, but also I think by consensus among producers, is to maximize cost in the sense of bringing down cost, make something that will be very low cost, reasonably durable, and efficient enough so that it's actually a gain over the status quo, right? That's the sort of optimal position. The idea is that that will be sellable in the domestic market in a way that foreign technology would not be as easily sellable in the domestic market. The sort of positive externality of that is that such new products are also highly desired across developing country markets all over the world, immediately as soon as they come out, and then begin to outcompete on price, especially those produced by European, American, or Japanese or Korean producers in those parts of the world as well. And so we've seen this happen with televisions, right, and with radios and things like this. We've seen it much more recently with wind turbines and solar cells and now electric vehicles. This is not new. It's the same kind of pattern. Now, the negative sort of undesired consequence of all of this strategy, and we've seen this again with much lower tech products and all kinds of things for many, many years, is the end result of kind of overproduction, overcapacity domestically, right? Because there's so many incentives to produce this, it becomes very low cost, very high efficiency of production. All these producers jump into this market and start just maximizing how much they churn out. Eventually, there's too much for anybody to buy. Look at the rental bicycles in Chinese cities about 5-6 years ago, just before COVID. I mean, mountains of them on every corner, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them piled up because there were simply way too many of them for even to fit on the street, let alone for people to actually want to use. Now, those are harder to just export, but imagine the same thing happening with EVs. That's basically where we're at now. So it's not that China has some insidious strategy to dump EVs in all kinds of other countries. Rather, simply that the Chinese market has produced so many of them that they're not saleable at home in the quantities being produced, and they're competitive abroad, both on quality and especially on price. So why not export them? But what that then means for smaller producers overseas is that they don't feel they can compete in their own markets, and then we get this sort of competition over them. And it's not going to stop with electric vehicles. If it's fuel cell cars next, it will be fuel cell cars. If it's other kinds of computer equipment, it will be that. I mean, it's going to take place with any product that the Chinese manufacturing sector, as now configured, moves into in a serious way, right? And this is not some nefarious plan or comprehensive strategy. It's actually something that China, as we were talking about before, is trying to move away from, right? It would be good not to do this over and over again. This produces part of the distortions that everyone recognizes inside China are preventing the kind of economic growth that China really wants, and driving some of the debt problems, asset price bubbles, et cetera, et cetera. So do we have time for more questions? Or no, we don't. We're actually out of time, unfortunately, exactly just 1 minute over time. Thank you for bearing with us at the beginning when we started a few minutes late. Thank you for all of your questions. We now have a coffee break and some refreshments available. Thanks.